The evening began with a warm glow across the large hall, the kind of soft light that made everything feel elegant, but still welcoming. People moved around dressed in polished outfits, chatting with ease as music played lightly in the background. At the center of the hall stood a grand piano, shining under the lights like it was waiting for something important to happen. It wasn't meant to be played that night. It was mostly there as a piece of decoration, a symbol of class at a charity event hosted by a well-known billionaire. The billionaire loved being the center of attention. He enjoyed making big gestures and loud jokes, the kind that made guests laugh even when the jokes weren't that funny. He enjoyed this power being the person everyone watched, and that evening, he was in an especially playful mood. As he walked around greeting his guests, he noticed the janitor quietly sweeping the far corner of the hall. The janitor moved slowly and carefully, trying not to disturb anyone. He kept his eyes down, doing his work without drawing attention to himself. Most people didn't notice him at all. He was just part of the background, someone whose presence blended in with the rest of the staff. But the billionaire saw him and felt like teasing someone. As he often did when he was bored, he motioned toward the janitor with a grin and said loudly enough for several guests to hear, "Hey, you, come here for a second." The janitor paused, unsure if the call was meant for him. When he realized it was, he set aside his broom and walked over slowly, his expression polite but careful. He wasn't used to being addressed by guests, let alone the host. The billionaire pointed at the grand piano with a dramatic gesture. "Tell me," he said, pretending to sound serious, "do you know anything about music?" The guests around him chuckled, already sensing he was setting up a joke. The janitor gave a small shake of his head. He didn't speak much. He preferred to let his silence keep things simple. Without waiting for an answer, the billionaire laughed and continued, "Well, I'll tell you what. Play something impressive on that piano, something difficult, and I'll marry you." He threw his head back laughing, as if he had just delivered the funniest line of the night. The guests joined in, not because they truly found it amusing, but because laughing along with him felt easier than questioning the joke. The janitor stood quietly, his posture calm. He didn't look embarrassed or angry. He simply listened. It wasn't the first time he had been teased by someone with more power. In places like this, being quiet often made him an easy target. But he didn't react. He just nodded slightly, like someone agreeing to a very ordinary request. Seeing his reaction, the billionaire laughed even harder. "Look at that," he said to the crowd. "He thinks he can do it." Some guests smiled awkwardly. Others whispered to one another, wondering what the janitor would do. A few felt uncomfortable but stayed silent, unwilling to ruin the mood. The music playing in the background had already faded. As people started paying attention to the scene, the grand piano, which had been nothing more than decoration moments earlier, now seemed like the center of the room. Guests shifted around, some stepping closer, curious to see how far the joke would go. The janitor still didn't speak. He didn't defend himself or explain anything. He simply turned his eyes toward the piano, studying it quietly. His expression didn't change, but there was something calm and steady in the way he looked at it, as if he was trying to decide whether to go along with the situation or walk away. The billionaire folded his arms with a big smile, clearly expecting the janitor to be too nervous or too embarrassed to approach the piano. He imagined the janitor would stumble, press a wrong note, and give everyone a reason to laugh again. To him, this was harmless entertainment. To the janitor, it was another moment where he had to choose between silence and courage. The room felt different now. The laughter had softened, and the curious looks had grown. Even the staff nearby paused what they were doing, watching quietly from the edges of the hall. They had seen the janitor every day, quiet, hardworking, respectful. He never asked for anything. He never complained. No one there could imagine him sitting at a piano. But the janitor finally took a slow breath and stepped forward, walking toward the grand piano with careful steps. People moved aside as he approached, their laughter shifting into surprise. Not a single person expected him to take the challenge seriously. The billionaire raised an eyebrow, amused but unaware of the shift happening around him. "Oh, you're actually going to try," he said with a teasing smirk. The janitor didn't respond. He simply reached the piano, ran his fingers thoughtfully over its polished edge, and pulled out the bench. He sat down in complete silence, his posture relaxed but focused. The guests leaned in, whispering to one another, waiting to see what would happen next. The room grew unusually still, the kind of stillness that made even the smallest sound feel louder. People stopped sipping their drinks, conversations faded, All eyes were on the quiet man sitting at the piano. He rested his hands on his lap for a moment, then gently placed them on the keys. He didn't look nervous. There was no shaking, no hesitation. He simply sat there, like someone returning to a place he had once known very well. No one knew what was about to happen, and more importantly, no one expected the truth that the joke that had begun with laughter was about to change into something unforgettable. The janitor closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and prepared to play. The room stayed quiet in a way that didn't feel normal for a busy event. It was the kind of silence that came when people weren't sure what they were supposed to feel. The guests didn't expect the janitor to sit at the piano. They expected him to laugh off the billionaire's joke or quietly walk away. But there he was, sitting on the polished bench as if the instrument belonged to him. People exchanged looks, some curious, some confused. The billionaire still wore a smirk, waiting for the moment the janitor would fumble or freeze. He seemed sure this would turn into a funny story he could retell later. But as the seconds passed, that confidence began to shift, even if he didn't show it. The janitor kept his hands resting on the keys, not pressing anything yet. His breathing was steady, and there was a softness in his eyes that made it seem like he was drifting somewhere else in his mind. It wasn't the look of someone who had been forced into a joke. It was the look of someone remembering something important. Most of the people in that hall didn't know anything about his life. To them, he was just a quiet man who cleaned the floors and emptied trash bins. But he had lived a very different life long before he ended up working here. A life he rarely talked about because it felt like something that belonged to another time. When he was young, music had been the most natural part of his world. His family couldn't afford luxuries, but there had been an old upright piano in their small home, left behind by someone who moved away. He had grown up touching the keys with wonder, teaching himself melodies he heard on the radio. A neighbor eventually noticed his talent and helped him get free lessons. For a while, music was the one place where he felt completely himself. But life didn't stay simple. As he grew older, responsibilities replaced dreams. Bills needed paying. Work came first. Music slowly faded into the background until he stopped playing altogether. The world around him changed, and he had no choice but to change with it. Still, the memories of those early days never left him. They rested quietly inside him, waiting for a moment like this one. Nobody in the hall knew any of this. They only saw a janitor sitting in front of a grand piano. To them, it looked like an impossible combination. A few guests whispered things like, "Do you think he'll even press a note? Or maybe he's just pretending." Others crossed their arms, expecting the moment to turn awkward. The staff, however, stood with a different kind of attention. They had worked with him long enough to know he carried himself with a quiet dignity. He wasn't the type to invite trouble or seek attention. So if he chose to sit at the piano, there had to be a reason. He gently pressed one key, letting the soft sound float across the room. It wasn't a showy moment. It was simple, almost like he was greeting the instrument. The guests leaned in without realizing they were doing it. Even the billionaire's joking expression shifted slightly, though he tried to hide it. The janitor lifted his hands again, letting them hover over the keys. The movement didn't look clumsy or uncertain. Instead, it looked practiced, like someone who had done this many times even if no one believed it. Before playing anything, he took a single deep breath, slow and careful. His shoulders relaxed. His expression softened even more. And for the first time that night, he looked truly at peace. The billionaire raised his voice from across the room, trying to lighten the tension. "Come on then, let's hear it," he said, still laughing but not quite as loud as before. The janitor didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence felt stronger than anything he could have said. He thought back to the many nights he had stayed late at work. Sometimes, after everyone left, he would pass by the empty hall where the piano sat unused. He always slowed down near it, wondering if he should sit and play just one song. But the fear of being discovered or judged kept him away. Tonight, however, something felt different. Maybe it was the way he had been called out in front of everyone. Maybe it was the memory of the child he used to be. Or maybe it was simply time. The memories of those early lessons, the joy his younger self felt, the way music once filled his home, all of it washed over him again. Without meaning to, he smiled faintly. Not at the crowd, not at the billionaire, but at the piano. The guests had no idea what was happening inside his mind. They only saw a quiet man who seemed lost in thought. Some grew impatient. Others grew more intrigued. One woman whispered to her friend, "He looks like he's about to play something real." Her friend shook her head. "No way, he's probably stalling." But they were both wrong. He finally placed both hands gently on the keys. This time, he didn't pause. He didn't look around. He didn't check who was watching. He simply let his fingers settle into a position that looked too confident to be accidental. A soft murmur rose from the guests. They could sense something was off about the situation, something different from what they had expected. The billionaire shifted his stance, folding his arms, his smirk weakening. What none of them understood was that the janitor wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared of failing or embarrassing himself. Instead, he felt almost grateful for the moment. For the first time in years, someone had placed him in front of a piano, not with kindness, but still, here he was. He remembered the feel of keys under his fingers from long ago. He remembered spending hours practicing pieces that felt impossible at first, only to master them slowly. He remembered the way music made him forget everything else, the noise, the worry, the heaviness of real life. That feeling began to return now, gently but unmistakably. He pressed another key, then another, forming a quiet pattern. It wasn't yet the piece the billionaire demanded. It was something different, almost like he was warming up, reminding himself what it felt like to move across the keys. A few guests exchanged a look. "He's not terrible," someone whispered under their breath. The billionaire blinked, his confidence flickering for the first time. He had expected the janitor to play like someone who had never touched a piano, but there was something about the way the janitor's fingers moved, calm, organized, gentle, that didn't fit that assumption. The janitor didn't rush. He wasn't performing for approval. He was reconnecting with a part of his life he thought he had lost forever. And as he touched the keys with growing ease, the hall slowly transformed. The laughter faded completely. The whispers softened. Even the lights seemed quieter somehow. He wasn't yet playing the real piece, but he was preparing not just his hands, but his heart. The memory of the challenging melody the billionaire mocked him with earlier drifted into his mind. He remembered hearing that piece years ago. He remembered practicing something similar, not perfectly, but well enough to understand it. His breathing grew steadier. His fingers grew surer. The soft warm-up notes turned into something more intentional. People leaned closer without realizing it. The staff held their breath, sensing that whatever was happening was more than just a joke. The billionaire tried to reassert control. "All right, that's enough warm-up. Play the piece." But even his voice didn't sound as strong as before. The janitor finally lifted his eyes from the keys and looked straight ahead, not at anyone, but at the silent room in front of him. He wasn't doing this to prove anything. He wasn't doing it to respond to the joke. He was doing it because something inside him said it was time. And as the room waited with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, he placed his fingers in position for the first real notes of the piece that would change everything. No one knew what they were about to witness, not even him. The moment the janitor placed his hands in position to begin the real piece, the room seemed to shrink into silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear or confusion. It was the kind that came from anticipation, the kind that wrapped itself around everyone and made them forget where they were. The guests, who had moments ago been laughing and sipping drinks, now stood still. Many of them held their breath without realizing it. The staff watched from the corners, frozen in place. Even the billionaire, who had started the whole thing as a joke, stood straighter, suddenly unsure of what he had created. The janitor didn't rush. He began gently, letting the first notes fall like small drops of water. They were soft but clear, rising through the hall in a way that felt almost unreal. People glanced at one another, eyes widening. No one expected the first note to sound that clean, that controlled. He continued, slowly at first, shaping the melody with care. His fingers moved with a steadiness that didn't belong to someone who had never touched a piano, as the billionaire had assumed. Instead, they moved with the memory of someone who once lived inside music. The billionaire blinked. "And sure," he whispered under his breath, "he's actually playing." But the words barely reached anyone. The guests were caught between surprise and disbelief. They leaned forward, their curiosity pulling them closer. The janitor didn't look at the crowd or at the billionaire. He didn't even look nervous. He simply followed the shape of the music as if the piano had been waiting for him. As the melody grew, the room seemed to breathe with it. Each note came with intention, light, gentle, yet firm. It wasn't just sound, it was emotion. It felt like a story told without words, rising out of the keys with each movement of his hands. People watched his fingers, stunned by the way they moved. They weren't stiff or shaky. They glided. They curved. They pressed with precision. It was the kind of movement that only came from years of practice, years of love for the instrument. And yet, no one there knew anything about his past. The janitor himself felt as if time had slipped away. The hall, the people, the billionaire, they all faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was the piano, the feel of the keys, the vibration of each note, the memory of what it felt like to play without fear. With each new phrase, the music grew stronger. What began as soft and careful soon became bold. His hands moved faster, shifting across the keyboard with confidence that made the guests gasp quietly. The melody wrapped around the room in waves, filling every corner. The guests exchanged shocked whispers. "I didn't know he could play like this. Is he a professional? Why is he working as a janitor?" But no one had answers, and still, he played. The janitor wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't performing for applause. He was letting something inside him pour out after years of being silent. Every movement of his hands felt like something familiar returning home. The billionaire, who had started the night laughing, now stood completely still. His smile was gone. His eyes narrowed, not in anger but in disbelief. He couldn't look away. The joke had turned into something he never expected. The music grew more intense. His fingers moved with such speed that some guests stepped closer, trying to understand how someone like him could play with such control. It didn't make sense to them. A janitor wasn't supposed to know how to do this. But talent didn't care about job titles, and everyone there was learning that quickly. The janitor's breathing shifted, deepening in rhythm with the music. He felt the peace flowing through him. The room seemed to warm around him. Memories he had tucked away years ago rose gently, memories of practicing late into the night, of teachers who believed in him, of moments when music was the only place he felt truly understood. He didn't think about the billionaire's challenge. He didn't think about being laughed at. He didn't think about the guests watching him. The piano became his world. And through that world, something unexpected happened. The guests weren't just watching. They were feeling. The music reached them in places words couldn't. Even those who had laughed earlier now stood with softened expressions. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked amazed. Many simply looked moved. The staff members who had worked with him every day felt a quiet pride growing inside them. They had always known he carried himself with calm strength, but they never imagined he had this hidden part of himself still. He played, his fingers danced across the keys, shifting from soft notes to strong ones with natural ease. The music rose, then fell, then rose again. It carried emotion that didn't need explanation: joy, pain, memory, hope. All of it blended into the notes. The billionaire finally spoke again, but his voice wasn't loud or playful. It was barely above a whisper. "What? Who is he?" But no one answered. They were too lost in the music. The janitor reached the middle of the piece, where the melody became more challenging, more demanding. His hands moved swiftly, crossing over each other, hitting difficult combinations that made the guests gasp quietly. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. It carried meaning. The janitor leaned into the music, letting the emotion guide him. The piano responded, its sound rich and full. The notes seemed to shimmer in the air, wrapping around everyone in the room. One guest whispered, "I can't believe this. How has no one ever seen him play?" Another replied, "He must have been trained. He has to be." The whispers faded again as the piece grew into its second big rise. The janitor's movements grew faster, more confident. His eyes stayed half closed, not because he was trying to look dramatic, but because he was lost in the feeling. For years, he had worked quietly, unnoticed. He had swept floors and emptied bins while hiding the part of himself that once felt limitless. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he let it show. The room felt different now. Electric, warm, alive. The billionaire's expression softened into something unfamiliar: humility. He had never expected to feel embarrassed in his own mansion. But seeing the janitor play like this made him realize the weight of his joke. The janitor didn't see any of this. His world was the piano. He reached the peak of the piece, where the notes burst forward with power. His hands moved so quickly that some guests instinctively stepped closer, unable to believe a janitor could play at this level. But talent wasn't tied to money or status. It lived in people who carried it quietly, waiting for moments like this. A few guests felt chills as the melody climbed higher. Someone whispered, "This is incredible." And then, slowly, the music began to soften. His hands slowed, easing into the final phrases. The melody became gentle again, almost tender. It felt like a soft goodbye to something he had missed for years. Guests held their breath. No one moved. The janitor played the last note with a touch so light it sounded like a sigh. He let his hands rest on the keys for a moment, then slowly lifted them away. Silence filled the hall, not the awkward silence from before, a deep, stunned, emotional silence. People stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, their eyes wide, their expressions soft, their thoughts tangled in shock and admiration. The billionaire, who had been so eager to laugh at him earlier, now stood frozen, his jaw slightly open. He looked at the janitor not with mockery, but with disbelief and a growing sense of guilt. The janitor finally took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle inside him. He didn't smile. He didn't look proud. He simply looked calm, as if the piano had given him back something he thought was lost forever. He stood from the bench quietly, just as he had approached it. No one clapped at first. People were too stunned to react. Then, slowly, a single pair of hands began to applaud. Then another. Then another. And within moments, the entire hall erupted into applause that echoed through the room like a wave. But the real shock was still to come, because while the music had left them speechless, the story behind it was even deeper, and no one there knew just how much more they were about to discover. The applause filled the room like a sudden storm, loud and full of emotion. It rolled through the hall in waves, bouncing off the walls and echoing into every corner. People clapped not just because the music was beautiful, but because they were shocked, moved, and even a little embarrassed for ever doubting him. Some guests clapped slowly, still trying to make sense of what they had just heard. Others clapped hard, almost as if trying to make up for their earlier laughter. The janitor didn't stand there soaking in the attention. In fact, he looked almost shy. He stepped back from the piano a little, lowering his eyes. It was clear he wasn't used to being in the spotlight. For him, the music had been something personal, not a performance meant to impress a crowd. He seemed unsure of what to do next. The billionaire, however, was frozen. His eyes were still wide, and the color in his face had changed. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something closer to shock. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time that evening, he had no joke, no loud laugh, no comment to throw into the room. He simply stared at the janitor like he had never seen him before. When the applause finally began to slow, people started whispering again. But these whispers were different from the ones earlier. They weren't mocking. They weren't doubting. They were filled with awe. I had no idea. Where did he learn to play like that? This was unbelievable. A few guests even looked emotional, as if the music had stirred something deep inside them. The staff members, who usually blended into the background, now looked proud. They exchanged small smiles, feeling like they had just discovered something precious about the person they worked beside every day. The billionaire finally took a step forward. His expression had changed completely. The playful arrogance was gone. He didn't look like a man in control anymore. He looked vulnerable, unsure even. He walked slowly toward the janitor, each step sounding heavy against the polished floor. The janitor kept his eyes lowered, not knowing what to expect. He had no idea what the billionaire was thinking, and he braced himself for anything. But something unexpected happened. The billionaire stopped just a few feet away and let out a long breath, almost like a sigh. For a moment, he didn't look like a man with money or power. He looked like someone who had just been reminded of something important. That was, he said softly, struggling to find the right words. I didn't expect that. Not at all. The janitor stayed quiet. He didn't want to say anything that might sound rude or ungrateful. You played beautifully, the billionaire continued, his voice gentler than anyone had ever heard it. I shouldn't have joked like that earlier. There it was, the apology. Guests exchanged looks. Some were surprised to hear the billionaire apologize so openly. He was known for being bold, confident, even a little careless with his words. But seeing the janitor's talent had clearly humbled him. The janitor nodded slightly, accepting the apology without making it awkward. He still didn't say much, but his calm expression seemed to reassure everyone. The billionaire straightened his posture. Where did you learn to play like that? He asked. The janitor hesitated. It had been so long since he talked about his past. A long time ago, he finally said quietly. I used to play when I was younger. That wasn't just something you learned as a kid. One guest interrupted from behind. That was real talent. More guests nodded, agreeing. The billionaire rubbed his jaw, still processing everything. Why didn't you ever tell anyone you could play like that? He asked. The janitor looked down, unsure of how honest he should be. Life changed, he said softly. I needed work. Music wasn't part of my world anymore. The room fell silent again, but this time in a thoughtful way. People could feel the weight of his words. They understood that life sometimes forced people to step away from their dreams. no matter how talented they were. One of the event organizers approached quietly. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a thoughtful expression. She studied the janitor for a moment, then said, "What you played, it wasn't just good, it was meaningful. You have something rare." The janitor shook his head lightly. "It was just something I remembered," he said. But she disagreed. "No, that kind of emotion doesn't come from memory alone. It comes from someone who loves music." The guests murmured in agreement. The billionaire let out another deep breath. "All this time," he said slowly, "I thought you were just another worker in the building." The janitor looked up, not offended, just honest. "I am," he said. "It's my job." "But you're more than that," the billionaire replied. "A lot more." Those words shifted the energy in the room. People nodded, seeing truth in them. Talent didn't disappear just because someone swept floors or worked late-night shifts. It stayed inside the person, even if no one else saw it. The event organizer stepped forward again. "Would you consider playing at one of our charity events?" she asked. "Not as a performer for money, just as someone sharing something beautiful with others." The janitor blinked, surprised by the offer. He hadn't played in front of people for many years, and he wasn't sure he was ready for such a step. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. "That's all we ask," she replied with a warm smile. The billionaire, still visibly humbled, nodded. "If you ever want to play again," he added, "we have a piano here. You're welcome to use it anytime." This surprised everyone. The billionaire wasn't known for offering anything freely. His generosity usually came with rules or expectations. But this offer was different. It felt genuine. The janitor thanked him politely. Guests slowly returned to conversations, but their tone had changed. The laughter was softer now, warmer. Many walked over to the janitor, offering kind words and admiration. They told him how moved they were, how they never expected such a performance, how his music made the night unforgettable. He accepted their words with humility, but he didn't let it overwhelm him. In his heart, he still felt like the same person, the quiet worker who did his job and moved through life calmly. But something inside him had shifted. He glanced at the piano again, feeling a soft pull. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of the passion he had lost. The piano didn't feel like a distant memory anymore. It felt close, familiar, like a door opening again. As the guests drifted back into conversations, the billionaire stood nearby, still observing him. "You know," he said, "I wasn't joking when I said the piece was difficult. I didn't think anyone here could play it." The janitor nodded, not bragging, simply acknowledging. "You didn't just play it," the billionaire added. "You made it sound alive." The janitor didn't know how to respond, so he simply gave a small nod. The billionaire stepped back, giving him space. But his expression said everything. He was grateful. He was impressed. And most of all, he was changed. As the night went on, the energy of the room remained different from before. People were kinder. Their voices were softer. Their smiles were more genuine. The music had touched everyone in a way they hadn't expected. The janitor eventually returned to his quiet place near the side of the hall. He didn't need the attention. He didn't need the praise. What mattered most to him was that he had felt alive again, even if just for a moment. The billionaire watched him leave the piano behind, a thoughtful look still on his face. He didn't know it yet, but the next part of the night would change things even more, because the story behind the janitor's talent was about to come to light, and it would leave the entire room stunned all over again. The room stayed silent for a long moment after the last notes faded. It was the kind of silence that no one wanted to break, because it still carried the emotion of the performance. The janitor sat there with his hands resting gently on the keys, breathing slowly as if he had just let go of something he had held inside for years. No one clapped at first, not because they didn't want to, but because they were still trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Then finally, someone started. A soft clap, then another. Soon the whole hall filled with applause that grew louder and louder, until it felt like the walls were vibrating. People stood up from their seats, some still stunned, some smiling, some shaking their heads because they couldn't believe how wrong their assumptions had been. The billionaire, who had been the one joking earlier, stood frozen for a moment. He looked around as if unsure what to do. The look on his face showed a strange mix of embarrassment, surprise, and something that almost resembled respect. He slowly walked toward the piano, cutting through the crowd that made way for him. Everyone watched closely, wondering what he was going to say. He stopped near the piano, cleared his throat, and tried to speak, but his voice cracked slightly. He took a moment before he tried again. This time he managed to find the right words, though they came out slower than usual. "I think I owe you an apology," he said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. His expression wasn't playful anymore. It wasn't mocking. It was real. "I thought it was just a joke. I didn't know." He paused again, searching for the right way to say it without sounding weak. "I didn't know you had something like this inside you." The janitor looked at him calmly. He didn't seem angry or offended. If anything, he looked peaceful, as if finally being seen for who he truly was brought him relief. He gave a small nod, showing that he accepted the apology without making a scene. The billionaire continued, this time speaking more confidently. "You're amazing, truly. I don't think anyone here expected that, including me." He put a hand over his chest. "You caught me completely off guard." Guests around them murmured in agreement, some smiling, some comforting each other because the performance had touched them emotionally. A few people even wiped their eyes quietly. Good music does that to people. It reaches places that words can't. A woman approached the janitor next. She introduced herself as someone who managed cultural programs and music grants. She told him she had connections with people who supported new talent, and that his performance had moved her deeply. She said she would be honored to help him return to music if he ever wanted a second chance. The janitor listened carefully. He didn't jump with excitement or act overwhelmed. He simply nodded with gratitude and said he had never expected anything like this. He only played because he was asked to, but hearing opportunities being offered made something inside him wake up again, a dream he once buried, because life had pushed him in another direction. More people gathered around, each wanting to say something. Some apologized for doubting him. Some praised his skill. Others told him the performance was the best part of the entire event. Even the staff members who knew him as quiet and hardworking looked at him differently now, proud to be around someone who carried such talent. The billionaire eventually raised a hand and asked everyone to give the janitor some space. When the crowd stepped back, he leaned closer and spoke in a softer tone. "You didn't deserve the way I treated you earlier. I shouldn't have made that comment. It was careless." He gave a small smile that finally looked genuine. "But I'm glad you proved me wrong, and I hope this night opens doors for you. You deserve it." The janitor thanked him politely. There was no anger left in him. The performance had already spoken louder than any words ever could. As the event slowly wrapped up, people kept coming to shake his hand or congratulate him. Some simply smiled at him from afar. The atmosphere wasn't the same anymore. The night had transformed because of one unexpected performance. When the hall finally became quieter, the janitor walked back to his cleaning cart. He placed his cloth and gloves neatly where they belonged, but there was a small smile on his face now. Something new, something hopeful. One of the younger staff members walked over and nudged him lightly. "You really shocked everyone today." His voice was full of admiration. The janitor chuckled softly. "I just played," he replied. "That's all, not just played," the staff member insisted. "You reminded everyone that talent can come from anywhere, and that people shouldn't judge so quickly." The janitor didn't argue. He simply nodded and continued organizing his cart. When he pushed it outside toward the hallway, he glanced once more at the piano in the center of the room. For the first time in years, he didn't feel distant from it. He didn't feel like the instrument belonged to another world. Instead, he felt a quiet connection returning, like an old friend he had lost touch with. Before leaving, he took a moment to stand near the doorway. He watched as guests still talked about him, mentioning his performance, replaying the song in their minds. Their words floated around the room, but he didn't cling to them. What mattered most to him was that he had finally allowed himself to express something he had kept hidden for too long. As he walked home later that night, he didn't rush. The air was cool, and the streets were calm. Lights from the nearby buildings reflected softly on the ground, giving the night a peaceful glow. He took slow steps, feeling lighter than usual. For years he had carried a quiet sadness inside him, a feeling that life had moved on without him. But tonight reminded him that life still had surprises waiting. He passed by a small music shop along the way. Its windows displayed old instruments, sheet music, and posters from concerts long gone. Normally he would just walk past without looking, but tonight he stopped. His eyes lingered on a simple upright piano placed near the window. He smiled to himself before continuing on his way. By the time he reached home, he knew his life might change soon. Maybe he would return to music. Maybe he would learn new things. Maybe opportunities would come. Or maybe nothing would happen at all. But he didn't worry about that. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. News about his performance spread over the following days. People who had attended the event shared clips and stories. Some praised his humility. Others talked about how important it is to never underestimate someone. The billionaire himself even spoke in an interview, admitting he had misjudged the janitor and expressing his respect for him. The janitor didn't let the attention overwhelm him. He stayed the same humble person he had always been, but he accepted one offer, a chance to visit a music studio and play when he felt ready. He didn't rush. He took his time, but he didn't let the chance slip away either. Weeks later, he stepped into the studio for the first time. The moment he sat at the piano, his fingers moved naturally. The sound filled the room, warm and full of life. The producers listening nearby exchanged looks, impressed by the ease with which he played. This time, the applause wasn't from a fancy event or wealthy guests. It came from people who truly understood music, and it meant just as much. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, and he didn't turn into a superstar overnight, but he took steady steps forward. He played more, practiced more, and slowly rebuilt the dream he once abandoned. The billionaire kept in touch too, not out of guilt anymore, but out of genuine respect. They even shared a few conversations about life, success, and how easy it is to overlook someone's true worth. In the end, what happened that night wasn't just a performance. It was a reminder to everyone who witnessed it and everyone who later heard the story, that people carry hidden stories, hidden skills, and hidden strength. You never truly know someone until you give them a chance. And the janitor? He finally found his way back to the thing he loved most, not because someone mocked him, not because he wanted to prove anything, but because the music inside him was always waiting for the right moment to return.